All right, welcome back, my little gremlins, to another episode. We have chapter 21 today. We are talking about a lot of information in this chapter, a very comprehensive chapter, and I will say a chapter that 90% I could say for sure, for certain, that you would see on the exam in May. So let's get started. Lots to talk about. So, what we've been talking about is really America at home, domestic policies, the progressive era, how to get the Gilded Age, over with, and how to reform our country. Now, we're going to talk about the foreign aspects and how America is starting to reach beyond their borders and how we're trying to grow as a country and really become a global power. So, we have slowly but surely growing, if you remember, all the way back since our beginning, since our colonial era. I've always said that we are a people of trying to go beyond our boundaries, right? Manifest destiny, although that's a term that's not coined until 1845, it's really something that's been embedded in our blood since we were colonists, right? Pushing past the 13 colonies to the Mississippi River to buy Florida and annex Texas and manifest destiny to the Pacific Ocean. And as of 1893, okay, a couple of weeks ago, we said Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay, that historian said the frontier was closed. Okay, that was it. We have reached the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny is over. However, it's not over. Okay, we are now going to start to talk about beyond our borders. So now, where does the United States go beyond California? Well, we start to look in our places, okay, as far as Latin America. All right, America really wants to become the dominant country of the Western Hemisphere. And so we, being that country that thinks we can be the number one in our side of the world, okay, we start to reach out, like I said, beyond our borders. Okay, we want that security, if you will, for the Western Hemisphere. So we realize that going into the Caribbean, into South America, Central America is essential to the security of our side of the world. Now, if you remember, this kind of sounds familiar to 1823 when we issued the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was in 1823. We had no business telling Europe to stay out of our side of the world. However, things worked out for us, circumstances worked out for us because in 1823, Napoleon had just died. Europe was exhausted from the Napoleonic Wars, and so the Monroe Doctrine kind of worked out in our favor just because of circumstances. Although we weren't as powerful, European countries kind of stayed out of our business, and America slowly but surely was becoming and growing into its own to become a powerful country. Now, why? Why go beyond our borders? Why imperialize or take over other places, in our side of the world? Well, economically speaking, okay, there's new markets to sell our stuff, and we can also use their raw materials to help better our situation. Now, this sounds very familiar because you should have talked about a very similar topic, imperialism, last year. You talk about England really being the shining example of an imperial country that was going into Africa and China, India, etc. Well, the United States wants to follow suit. Okay, they too want to be, get all the spoils from being an imperial country. So beyond the economic reasons, the political reasons are also there as well. Okay, like I said, we want to compete with those other countries like England, for example. Strategic. As we go to other places, okay, according to an author named Alfred T. Mahan, we should set up little naval bases throughout the world. It's how we make ourselves a known presence. So as we go to Puerto Rico and Cuba and then maybe into the Philippines, etc., set up naval bases along the way. And what it does is it helps our growing power, our influence throughout the world. And that's what Alfred T. Mahan talks about in The Influence of Sea Power. He says, listen, in order to pull this off, you need a powerful navy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt will read this book and actually believe pretty much every word of it and say, you know what, he's right. Okay, and we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt, what he does in a little bit. But this also leads to us, not only building naval bases, but also building things like the Panama Canal, okay, which is very essential to our economy and to help us, okay, with the military later on. Now, ideological motives for imperialism, you have the white man's burden, okay, another term that you should be familiar with from last year. The white man's burden says, hey, listen, okay, all other races are inferior, and it's our responsibility, our burden, if you will, to show these other civilizations the way. Okay, obviously a bit of a racist connotation there. Social Darwinism as well, okay, that it's, it's up to us to kind of apply our learned behaviors to show these other civilizations how to run essentially. Um, and again, it's all part of this idea that the Anglo-Saxon civilization is superior to all others. Again, racist. But these, nonetheless, are our motives for imperialism. Pretty much a mirror image of why the British do it. Okay, so just fast forwarding through some things here. Okay, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine was 1823, and we kind of got away with it for a long time. But now Teddy Roosevelt, as president, he says, you know what? I like that policy. And what he's going to do is he's going to bring it back, and he's going to add a little something onto it. So he's going to call this his Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's like a little addition. He says, yes, we are still keeping to the idea that Europe should stay out of our business, but if they don't, we are willing to use the military to, get what we want essentially. Okay, it's kind of like a little bit more of a threat. So what will Teddy Roosevelt do to kind of represent this idea? Well, we're going to intervene in a lot of Latin American affairs, okay, whether it be revolutions, independence movements, etc. There's going to be various ways in which America is going to insert themselves into Latin American relations, okay? Now for the United States, okay, because we're a little bit more powerful, it's going to help us. And for those Latin American countries, they're not going to be very happy about this, okay? We're essentially taking the place of an England or a France, okay, or Portugal, who is, dominating Latin America. And then the United States says, we'll kick them out for you, but maybe we'll take their place instead. So, a lot of places are going to get American troops in the DR and Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, etc. And, like I said, we're replacing those other powers. So again, how much is changing? Okay. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, okay, we talked about all of his domestic policies last week, but the biggest foreign policy that we need to know about him is what I just mentioned, which was his Roosevelt Corollary. So just to rewind a little bit on Teddy Roosevelt and who he is, remember he's a pretty larger than life character. He was not elected president at first. He becomes president because McKinley is assassinated. And Teddy Roosevelt, having read that Alfred T. Mahan book about having a powerful Navy, he's going to want to build the Navy, and he's going to want to make America a really proud and powerful country. One of the biggest quotes that comes from Teddy Roosevelt is "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Now, his big stick diplomacy, this idea that we're about to talk about in a second, says, hey, listen, I'm totally willing to be diplomatic and talk about things that I want. However, if I don't get what I want, I'm not afraid to use the military, the American military, to get what I need. Okay, and so that is something that we need to also make sure that we know as well. So, in saying this, Roosevelt is obviously under the idea that America's responsibility is to kind of be the police force of the Caribbean and Latin America. This big stick diplomacy, as you can see in the cartoon here, he is, parading through the Caribbean saying, hey, listen, here's my powerful navy behind me. I have my big stick, and I'm willing to, basically take out anybody who is going to threaten that idea that America wants to become that dominant country. Okay, but to him, we are the police force. And through that, okay, how do we do that? He helps, like I said before, build a navy and what's going to be called the Great White Fleet. Okay, for all the ships that he's going to build before he's president. I mentioned this last week. He, was before president, he was assistant secretary to the Navy, and believing that America's dominance is going to happen only if we have a big, powerful Navy, he builds it up before he's president, and then he's going to be willing to use it once he's president. Okay, so his Great White Fleet just represents the growing military presence of America throughout the world. Okay, so we talked about the Caribbean and Latin America and some examples there. Now, Roosevelt in Asia, East Asia, he's also going to have a huge role there as well. Now, last year you talked about the Russo-Japanese War. This was a war in which was a big surprise for a lot of the world because this is the first time a Asian country had beaten an Anglo-Saxon, white country in warfare. So the world was pretty shocked. And who's the guy that really puts who brings together, mediates the peace accords, if you will, is Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, and he actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for ending that war. But other than that, okay, notable was his Gentleman's Agreement in 1908. There were a lot of laws in California in particular on the West Coast because we saw a lot of Asian immigrants in the West Coast because of building the railroad in the past and then staying there afterwards. A lot of racism and discrimination there, and there was a lot of segregation as well. So Teddy Roosevelt actually has what's called a gentleman's agreement, okay, with Japan that says, okay, here's the deal. San Francisco in particular, okay, we are going to come to a compromise where if America restricts or agrees to restrict the emigration of Japanese workers, okay, in return, okay, then California will repeal its laws. So a gentleman's agreement is usually like a handshake agreement. It's not a written agreement. So again, this is not a written thing. So what Teddy Roosevelt is willing to do is say, hey, listen, Japan, we know that you don't like that America is being really racist toward you guys and nativist and, scared of yellow peril and taking over. We get that. Teddy Roosevelt says, Japan, here's what we're going to do. Okay, we're going to repeal those segregation laws, those racist laws against Asian immigrants if you just, tell your people not to come here. Okay, so that's kind of the gentleman's agreement. And again, okay, you can see a lot of nativism and racism in this, but nonetheless, okay, that is something Teddy Roosevelt does. Now, one of the biggest things Teddy Roosevelt is also known for is helping to create something that's very beneficial for trade and also the military. So for trading, before Teddy Roosevelt's idea of the Panama Canal, it would take 13,000 miles to go from basically one end of the continental U.S. to the other, okay, because you had to sail all the way around South America and then to the West Coast. Roosevelt says, listen, why don't we cut that trip in half and try to offer Colombia some money to basically dig a trench, which obviously will be a canal, to shorten that ride. Colombia, for $10 million, refuses his offer. Now, I said before, when Teddy Roosevelt doesn't get what he wants, well, he's going to be willing to use force to get what he wants, and that's exactly what he does. So instead of that 13,000-mile trip, okay, how do we get the Panama Canal if Colombia is unwilling to allow us to do so? Well, Teddy Roosevelt says here, I want to actually talk to the people of, okay, what will become called Panama, but originally was part of Colombia. He says, okay, hey, people in Panama, do you want your independence from Colombia? And they're like, yes, we would love that. Teddy Roosevelt says, okay, I got you. Here's what we're going to do. America's going to help you win your independence against Colombia. In exchange, once you have your independence, you're going to allow us to build a canal for your country. Panama says, okay. And they gain their independence. Okay, it's successful. And then in return, America will build the Panama Canal, which, as you can see there on the chart, on the map there, rather, the trip is more than cut in half, okay, which saves a lot of time and a lot of money. That's good for trade, and also the military. Okay, if there's an emergency, we need to get the Navy from one side of the world to the other. Okay, that trip becomes a lot shorter. All right, so America will build this Panama Canal. Okay, the Isthmus of Panama. Right, and so you can just see this is mostly a repeat here. A lot of the things, a lot of the troubles going into building the Panama Canal. It's going to take us a long time. It's going to take us about 10 years to build it. A lot of people are going to die because of things like yellow fever and bubonic plague. A lot of white guys are not used to this climate, and the mosquitoes killing people. So just not good working conditions. But eventually, it is going to be finished, and the United States has control of it, which means, okay, the United States is going to reap the benefits off of other countries using it. Okay, you have to pay a toll to go through it, and so that's a look at what it looks like today. That Panama Canal was very beneficial economically for the United States. Okay, and we have a 99-year lease on it. This is just a chart here to see how a canal works. Okay, there's a series of locks, and they act as like doors, and they suck the water in or push water, suck the water out or push water in according to the level of the land. What do I mean? What am I talking about? Here's just a brief video just to kind of show you what I mean. This is taken from one of my friends who's in the Army who went to the Panama Canal. This is a time-lapse video. So now what you're about to see is the ship. You see it lowers. They suck the water out. The locks, the door is open. Same thing here. You can see it lowers. They suck the water out. Door is open. And then one more time, and then they're out into the open sea. Okay, these are how canals work. This is how the Panama Canal works, or the Erie Canal. They all work relatively the same. Okay, so let's talk about the Spanish-American War. This is a war that the United States definitely benefits from big time. So we'll start with Cuba. The story starts here because Cuba was under the control of Spain still, and a lot of Cubans were falling victim to some horrible crimes by the Spanish. And so they were really calling out for help. They needed help. And a lot of this help, or a lot of these crimes, if you will, are being publicized in American newspapers. And so the American public starts to become a little bit sympathetic with the Cuban cause, okay, for independence. And so this really was heightened, if you will, or emphasized by yellow journalism. Now, this brings us back to a term we introduced last week, in which I said it was kind of out of place, that it didn't really make sense in chapter 19, however your book did it. Nonetheless, yellow journalism is exaggerated storytelling. So here's what it does make sense, is this exaggerated storytelling, Hertz and Pulitzer are publishing these newspaper articles in America that are getting or embellishing, if you will, the stories, the harm doings to the Cubans by the Spanish, and the American public, as I mentioned before, starts to become sympathetic with this Cuban cause, and this is one of our causes for the Spanish-American War. Now, what kind of bad things were they doing? There's what they call reconcentration camps, where a lot of Cubans were worked to death, dying of starvation, and obviously that's not cool. So you say, okay, why does the United States care so much? Were we really good humanitarians? No, unfortunately. Okay, what we do care about is the value in it for us. Why would we get involved? Because if Cuba gains its independence, that can help us by gaining control of their sugar plantations, and that allows us, another raw material resource that can help us, produce stuff. So you take yellow journalism being one major cause we get involved in this war against Spain. Cause number two was something called the Delone letter, in which a Spanish official publishes this letter, pretty much bashing our president, President William McKinley, and a president doesn't want to be bashed. They don't want to be talked bad about, and so publicly, no less. And so this was also another thing that led us to war. The final straw was when one of our ships, the USS Maine, was exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba, and this is going to be the last straw. Okay, this ship we believe to have been blown up by the Spanish. In retrospect, there was actually no evidence that they did it. There was more evidence that it was a mistake, an accident on board that had explosives and they went off, and that the ship sunk. And that's retrospect though. Nonetheless, on February 15th, 1898, the Maine explodes, and we blame the Spanish, and that's the last straw. America is fully behind declaring war against Spain. The war is on like Donkey Kong. So, now that the war is on, and us versus Spain, you would think, okay, that all this controversy, okay, is going to going to end up, not good for us, okay, that we got ourselves into a mess here. But you can see the day after the Maine was exploded, this newspaper article, you can see the title is what I really want you to see, is Destruction of the Warship Maine was the work of an enemy. This is yellow journalism at its finest, okay? It's purposely using words to try to draw your attention and to get, angry, invoke a feeling inside you and say, you know what, we should help out those Cubans. So America gets involved. The yellow press is definitely one of the causes, something to blame, if you will. And right before the war begins, okay, we pass something called the Teller Amendment. This says, hey, listen, we're going to fight this war for you, Cuba. We're going to help you out. However, we are telling you in this amendment we have no intention of taking you over. We'll keep that in mind. So the war actually doesn't begin in Cuba. It begins in the Philippines. Kind of surprised the Spanish fleet there. Overall, this entire war is a huge success for the Americans. It's really a landslide victory and a huge reason as to why we are starting to become a global power. The Secretary of State, John Hay, at the time referred to this as a splendid little war because it really was. It was a very short war, a couple of months long, and we'll talk about the effects and what we get from it in a moment. Teddy Roosevelt, future president, right at this time, he's not president just yet, but he fights in the war. He had resigned from his position at the time to go fight in the war, and he fought in what was called the Rough Riders. They were a cavalry group, and he survives the war. He's in a couple of really important battles, San Juan Hill, for example, and he makes it, and obviously will become president afterwards, and Americans really love him even more for his part in the war. Now, the Treaty of Paris will end the war. Okay, this should spark something in your memory saying, wait, the Treaty of Paris, we've talked about Treaty of Paris before. We've talked about two, and this is why I told you all the way back in the beginning of the year, it was so important that you knew the years to the Treaty of Paris. There's three Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Paris of 1763 ended the French and Indian War. 20 years later, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 ended the American Revolution. Now, the third Treaty of Paris we talk about, the third and final one, is this one, the Treaty of Paris of 1898. It ends the Spanish-American War. So what do we get from it? What do we get from this war? We get a lot of territories, okay? It's a 15-week war. Cuba is free. Guam and Puerto Rico become territories of the United States. The Philippines, okay, will be sold to us for $20 million. And Cuba, okay, although they're free and independent, okay, they will basically kind of be under control of the United States a little bit through, a naval base that we took Guantanamo Bay. and we're going to see how we alter that Teller Amendment in a second. So again, a lot of good things come from this, okay, in the sense of territories gained. This is a big example of imperialism for us, and Congress is going to allow a lot of this to happen. Now, not everybody's on board with this, okay? There is, and you need to be aware of this anti-imperialistic league. These are people that are, just as like the title says, anti-imperialistic. They are not for this, okay? People like Andrew Carnegie, the AFL, and Samuel Gompers. Remember him, Mark Twain. Those are some notable people to associate with being part of the anti-imperialistic league. Definitely should know that. However, McKinley being an expansionist and a manifest destiny proponent, he and Congress are going to approve the treaty in which allows us to take those territories from the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so America is on its way to becoming that global power, as mentioned. But what happened to the Teller Amendment? I thought we weren't going to take over Cuba. Okay, well, that's going to be altered by what's called the Platt Amendment a couple of years later. The Platt Amendment says, okay, listen, Cuba, you are your own country. However, the United States is allowed to intervene in your affairs if we need to restore peace, if you get involved in a war, let's say. You can't sign a treaty with another country unless we approve it, and we're going to set up a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. So again, it doesn't really sound like Cuba is really being too free there. Spain is gone, but America kind of takes their place. Okay, that's not exactly right. Okay, so now the question is about some of these territories. What does territory mean? What kind of rights do you have in a territory? Are they a state? Do you have the same rights as far as the Bill of Rights goes? Who knows? So that's where it comes to with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is one of those territories that becomes part of the United States through the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Now, the Four-Acre Act in 1900 says Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory and they have limited degrees of popular government, which means they have their own government that rules on their own laws. By 1917, they're going to grant U.S. citizenship to these people. So, wait, if the people of Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens, do they enjoy the same rights and freedoms as an American citizen living in stateside? Well, that's a question that's going to have to be addressed with the insular cases, which is a bunch of cases that essentially were going to answer that question. And what the Supreme Court decides is that just because these Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, it does not mean they are automatically entitled to all of our rights and freedoms. So it's kind of a gray area. They're U.S. citizens. They can travel here without a passport, but they aren't necessarily protected by every single one of our freedoms. If they were to become a state, then they would have the equal autonomy, if you will, of all of our rights. And that question always comes up every couple of years. Is Puerto Rico, or should Puerto Rico become a state or not? Okay, timeline there. Okay, Cuba, we talked about some of these things. the results of the war and what happens in some of the places that we helped after the war, like the Philippines, for example. The Philippines were really upset after we left. Um, because we helped them gain their independence against Spain, but then America kind of took their place, and America has to deal with a little rebellion by the Filipinos, which is going to be a failure on their part. However, some good things come out of the United States getting involved, staying in the Philippines, like building hospitals and bridges and roads, etc. But guys like this, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was like, wait, I fought with you in the Spanish-American War, but now I'm fighting against you for our independence. He's not cool with the whole idea that the America stays, but America will hold on to the Philippines until after World War II. Just to give you an idea, okay, there's Hawaii and there's the Philippines. Okay, the Philippines is our stepping stone to East Asia, to China, for example, and Japan. Very useful to have the Philippines and getting us closer to those open doors in the other Asian countries. Now, speaking about Hawaii, Hawaii was its own country as well, and Hawaii was minding its own business, and they had this queen, Kualilikalani, in which, who was a monarch, obviously, and America sees an opportunity to overthrow the queen, to help overthrow the queen with the people of Hawaii. And again, it's all about money, okay? To not only the sugar plantations and such, but also another stepping stone to Asia. And America is all for that. So America eventually will get involved to overthrow the Queen. And by 1898, that is, Congress in America decide to annex or make part of the United States Hawaii. And they become a state now. Okay? Just another example of us, being imperialistic. Okay. Now, East Asia. We talked about the Philippines. Now let's talk about how we get into China, right? We've been talking about those stepping stones to get us closer to China. Throughout the 1800s, Europe had been all about getting into China and carving up their spheres of influence, right? That term you should recognize from last year. Well, the United States wants a piece of the pie as well. The United States is, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to issue a policy called the Open Door Policy in 1899. This says, hey, listen, all countries should have equal access to China. Wow, so how nice of us. We all care about having an equal piece of the pie. No. America's out for themselves. We're saying, hey, listen, everybody should have equal access because we really want access. We were the ones being kind of shunned and late to the party here. But nonetheless, America will get a little piece of the pie in China. And, obviously China is not too cool about this. As you remember back to last year, they do have rebellions like the Boxer Rebellion, in which they tried to put down the Western forces, and they are unsuccessful in doing so. But America and the European countries, okay, they take little pieces of China for their own countries. Now, we talk about imperialism. You would definitely know these presidents as being the guys who are expanding the role of the United States throughout the world. Also, 3 of them out of the 4 are the progressive presidents as well. So we talked about their domestic policies, last week. We're talking more about their foreign policies this week. The only guy that's added here is William McKinley. But William McKinley, he is a big-time imperialistic guy because, remember, it's under his presidency we have the Spanish-American War, and we also annexed Hawaii. What about Woodrow Wilson? We didn't really talk about him and his foreign policies, right? We talked about McKinley, we talked about Roosevelt, we talked about Taft and his dollar diplomacy. What about Wilson and his what he calls moral diplomacy? This is kind of a step back from Roosevelt and Taft, who were all about getting involved in Latin America and trying to dominate them with either the military or American businesses. Wilson's moral diplomacy is more about America being the big brother to those countries and trying to let them learn from us and not essentially take them over. This will help improve relations in Latin America and also the Philippines, but things will take a step back as we get into the 1920s when we kind of go back to dollar diplomacy with those presidents after World War I. But nonetheless, okay, moral diplomacy was a step in the right direction, and Wilson recognized that we should be more of a big brother rather than be seen as someone who's trying to take over or dominate the region. What does Wilson do as far as moral diplomacy? He's got a little bit of an issue with Mexico, for example. Mexico is very valuable to the United States. We have a lot of companies that do business with Mexico, and Mexico is going through some hard times here. They have their revolution, and they have a rotating leadership and dictators who are just kind of disrupting that even flow of cash and business going on there. So Woodrow Wilson will refuse to recognize a government that is going to endanger the people, and more importantly, or put into danger our companies that are operating out of Mexico. So things come down to the wire here with Pancho Villa, who is one of those guys who takes power. He is going to be really thorn in the side for Woodrow Wilson. He is going to lead multiple raids across the United States on the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and shots being fired back and forth, and things really start to heat up. You say, why? Why is Pancho Villa really upset with us? Well, Mexico's still not over the issues that we had with them in the Mexican-American War all the way back in 1848, because they lost a lot of land to America, if you remember. So they are certainly still bitter over that, and Woodrow Wilson is really trying to not bring conflict here, but Pancho Villa is kind of pushing his hand. In the end, Pancho Villa and Woodrow Wilson, their conflict is really going to be overshadowed by the beginning of World War I. And we always think, okay, it's such a random thing with the Zimmerman note, but it really wasn't. The Zimmerman note was a product of our tensions with Mexico heading into World War I. So stay tuned. But for now, Woodrow Wilson was trying to be the moral diplomacy and be diplomatic about things, but Pancho Villa is leading a lot of raids, and Woodrow Wilson is really trying not to use force against Pancho Villa, whereas Teddy Roosevelt certainly would have. But things will culminate with that Zimmerman note coming up in World War I. Okay, so all this expansion is ultimately leading us into a major world conflict, the Great War. Now, America, as you may remember back to last year, wasn't exactly involved from the beginning. However, we get dragged in. So while we're trying to expand our borders and imperialize other places throughout the world, the major world conflict, as known back then as the Great War, or to us now in history as World War I, occurs. Now, you don't really need to know the causes for World War I out in Europe for this class. That's for world history. However, you remember mania, the militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. While all that's going on for a couple of years, America and Woodrow Wilson are maintaining a foreign policy of neutrality. That's what you do have to know. So obviously, this is a U.S. history class. You have to know where we fall on things in our foreign policy. In this case, is neutrality, right? We're following that precedent from good old George Washington. Now, it is really hard to maintain that neutrality with everything going on. The United States, to this point, has remained neutral. However, we're going to take a look right now and see we really aren't neutral. How so? Okay, first off, if we needed to get involved in the war, it's pretty clear whose side we would get involved on and help out because we share a lot of common ties with England, and whether it be our legal system, our language, or them just being our mother country a long time ago. England is our closest tie, and it's pretty clear that we would help them out. Now, Germany, we don't have that close connection with, okay? Germany has a very different history than us, and sure, there's been a lot of immigrants from Germany, but that doesn't make us a byproduct of Germany, and we don't share a lot of commonalities, with a language or a legal system, etc. Now, when World War I breaks out and the United States still isn't involved yet, there is a lot of public sentiment that is anti-German. For example, libraries start pulling books that are of German authors, and German music on the radio will be pulled. And you'll start to see a lot of propaganda that is anti-Germanic as well. And so, on top of that, American manufacturers, bankers, and investors are more heavily invested on the French and the English side because of trades and businesses that do commerce with those countries. And when England starts to blockade Germany, because remember, England, in this time of history, world history, has a very powerful navy, the most powerful navy in the world. And when they blockade Germany, the United States continues to trade with England instead of, both sides. So again, are we really neutral? No, not really. We have a lot of common ties to England and France, but on top of that, we continue to trade with England, and we will stop trading with Germany because of that blockade. Obviously, Germany is going to be upset about that, and they're going to call us out. Things start to heat up when a couple of boats are sunk. Now, the Lusitania is the most famous one. Okay, that's a British ship, but it had 128 Americans on board. The Sussex is another ship that is not an American, and that has Americans on board. And after the Sussex is sunk, Woodrow Wilson says, Germany, hey, listen, you're killing Americans in which a war that we're not involved in. And Germany says, listen, okay, all right, we get it. We pledge, the Sussex pledge, we pledge we're not going to sink any more ships without warning. Okay, and so for the meantime, things seem as if, they're okay. But honestly, Germany can see through our little lie there of neutrality, and they know that we're still trading with the English and the French. So, the Lusitania and the Sussex are one cause that are getting us closer to getting involved in World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson has spent one full term in office, and to this point, he has kept America out of war. That's really what he runs his campaign on, and Americans are cool with that. They like that. They don't want to get involved in this European conflict, and so he will be reelected to a second term. Now, things start to heat up even more when we see the Germans kind of violate our neutrality again by sending a note to Mexico. And I mentioned this earlier, the Zimmerman note, which, I guess when you're younger in middle school and elementary school, probably middle school, you talk about this, it seems out of left field, why all of a sudden would Germany want Mexico to get involved in the Great War? Seems so random. Well, as we now know in AP US history, it's not so random. We had a lot of issues with Mexico heading into World War I, as you remember, okay, with Pancho Villa in particular. So the Zimmerman note, which was, intercepted by the British, it was from Germany to Mexico saying, hey, listen, Mexico, why don't you help us out and join the, the war? And when the war is over, we'll help get you back all that land you lost to America in the Mexican-American War, right? We said they're still bitter about that. Now, this is intercepted. It never makes it. And the British come running to the Americans saying, look what we got. This is our cause number 2 for America to get involved in World War I. First was the Lusitania and Sussex, now the Zimmerman note. Well, finally, the last straw is, the third and final cause is Germany goes back on the Sussex Pledge and starts to sink ships again without warning. They resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And so Now America has a choice, okay? Do we join or do we continue to get stepped on? And Congress in April 1917 will appease Woodrow Wilson and vote for war against Germany. So now that America is involved, okay, we have a lot of questions to answer. How are we going to pay for this war? How are we going to produce for this war? How are we going to pay for this war? There's so many questions. All right, a lot of questions to answer. And a couple of those answers come with one, the Selective Service Act, which is how we raise an army. Okay, that's another or fancy term for the draft. How do we finance the war? We food ration, which means, okay, we don't eat as much. Everybody's only allowed to eat certain amounts or buy certain amounts from the supermarket. War bonds, okay. We talked about the concept of bonds in the past. This is a um, IOU note essentially. You loan money to the government and they promise they'll pay you back. We increase our output, okay, so our factories producing a lot of stuff, and propaganda, okay, gets people more towards the war effort, and we will see this successfully done by the U.S. Okay, we mass produce wartime goods, and America has been waiting for a moment like this to really show our industrial strength and enter, okay, a war, a global conflict. So amongst raising an army through the draft and completely turning all of our industries towards the war effort, which we call total war, um, we are also going to have a couple of agencies created by the government to help with the war effort. So, for example, a National War Labor Board. This basically is going to make sure there's no labor disputes. We do not want to strike in times of war. So the AFL, remember them, the American Federation of Labor, they totally support the war effort, and they're going to make sure that there are no disputes between the workers and the union, okay, the business owners, I should say. The War Industries Board sets production priorities for war, saying, okay, we don't really need a factory to produce, dresses. We really need that factory to start producing ammunition. So that's something the War Industries Board would do. The U.S. Food Administration, who is headed by a future president named Herbert Hoover, who we'll talk about in a few weeks, makes sure that the food in our country is being properly distributed and not too much is being consumed by Americans, and that we have enough to go to the soldiers overseas. Now, World War I is also going to boost the support for the 18th Amendment, which is interesting. Remember, we talked about this during the antebellum era and also during the progressive era, that the banning of alcohol is seen as a immigrant problem. And remember, the Germans in particular have a very different stance on alcohol, and so you're going to see the 18th Amendment actually pass a little bit right after World War One, not just because of the war, but it only added to that fight that there was a immigrant problem, and everybody is so anti-German during World War One. All right. Now, silencing dissent. Now, this is interesting because we're so big on freedom of speech, and throughout our country's history, we've poked holes in that idea that during times of war, everybody doesn't exactly have all of those 10 amendments, all of those Bill of Rights, and all those constitutional liberties. So what happens during World War One is you have the Espionage and Sedition Acts that are passed. And it basically said, hey, listen, one, you're not allowed to interfere with the draft or war effort, and two, you cannot criticize the government. Now, this sounds like the government is taking too much power and trying to silence those who want a voice, but this is going to culminate in a very big Supreme Court case. So that case is Schenck versus the United States. Now, Charles Schenck, what he did was he was um, sending pamphlets to a lot of people trying to tell them to dodge the draft. A draft dodger means you're trying to avoid getting drafted to go to war. So what he's doing is he's violating those Espionage and Sedition Acts. He's criticizing the government on top of also trying to persuade others not to get drafted and go to war and support the war effort. The Supreme Court says Schenck was wrong and that during times of war, you unfortunately do not exercise those same constitutional liberties, and that he was creating what they called a clear and present danger. Best example today would be if you're in a movie theater, you cannot scream fire in a movie theater unless there's an actual fire. Otherwise, you will be arrested and charged with the idea that you are presenting clear and present danger. So again, this comes up once more where we talked about during times of war, right? The Civil War was the last time we talked about this, with Lincoln suspending things like habeas corpus and putting people in jail just because they didn't agree with his ideas or the Union. Now this comes up during World War I again, and the federal government is doing similar things to suppress people's civil liberties. And the reason the government is allowed to do it, they say, is because national security outweighs civil liberties. So America enters the war. We are going to affect the war in a positive way. The American troops are fresh, they're hungry, they're well equipped, they're producing a lot of stuff. It's really thanks to women back at home taking the jobs of the men, and this is really going to push the war effort in favor of the Allies during World War One. On top of women taking jobs in the factories, we're also going to have African Americans move to the cities during World War One to also take those vacant jobs from the soldiers. And you're going to see about 400,000 African Americans enter the armed services as well. But the Great Migration is something you definitely should know. The Great Migration refers to the African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South to escape segregation and that racism to go to the North, take those jobs in those factories. The social impact home front, there's a lot of things going on. We know the progressive era is now really going to come to a standstill, if you will. But women, because of their help with taking those jobs during World War One, this is actually going to be a huge push for the 19th Amendment, which grants women suffrage finally. And we've kind of been saying this story was coming for a while, but I have mentioned in the past, World War One is what puts it over the edge for women. Women have been able to, during the war, show that they are able to do the same job as men, and finally, they are able to culminate their suffrage fight with the 19th Amendment in 1919, and officially in 1920, women will have the right to vote. Interesting story about this right here. This picture is you see the women with the signs, Mr. President, etc. What's ironic is that when this picture is taken, the women do not know that Woodrow Wilson at the time had a stroke. He was not able to perform his duties as president, and his wife took over. And so that's ironic that there was actually a woman really running the presidency and the government at this time, and very few people knew, let alone these women, obviously, who are saying, "Hey, listen, give women equal rights." And lo and behold, there is a woman at this time at the head of the table. Okay, so we obviously fast forward through World War One. We do not talk about battles or things like that. We really are only concerned about causes and effects as far as wars. So we talked about why America gets involved. We talk about the effects on America's home front. Well, now we talk about the end of the war now and the effects. So World War One comes to an end. Okay, we know the Allies are going to win. The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends World War One. But now it's time to talk about Woodrow Wilson's part in all this. Woodrow Wilson is really a man ahead of his time. He has quite a few ideas that are just not going to fly with some of the other leaders of the world during this time. I'm a firm believer that if he were to be around after World War II, that his ideas would have been widely accepted. And who knows, if his ideas were accepted after World War I, we may not have had a World War II. Nonetheless, his Treaty of Versailles, he's a strong advocate for it. He has his own little portion called the 14 Points, where he proposes a few things to other countries of the world when this conflict is over. His 14 points include things like self-determination. They include ideas of, open borders, for trading, trade barriers and freedom of the seas. And one of the points, okay, that he calls for is a League of Nations. He wants the major countries of the world to come together in this organization, a peacekeeping organization, to prevent any future wars from happening. Now, the League of Nations we know is going to happen, but the problem is, okay, his own League of Nations, Americans don't want any part of it, and Congress is actually going to shut this down. The biggest advocate for the League of Nations is Woodrow Wilson, and the biggest opponent to it is Henry Cabot Lodge. And Congress will vote down his League of Nations because Americans do not want to get involved in world affairs. They want to go back to neutrality. So they want this reversal of policy where for oh so long, since George Washington, we had been isolationist, we had been neutral in foreign affairs. World War I brought us into that conflict. We had no choice, but now Americans want to go back to it. And it's all because of Article 10, Article X, if you will, and that was the idea of the League of Nations. Because if we were involved in the League of Nations, that means we'd have other allies, and if those allies got in a fight, got in a war, America would have to get involved according to the League of Nations. And remember, one of the causes for World War I was alliances, and Americans say, you know what, we don't want to do that. We want to go back to isolationist neutrality, and so we do. So the League of Nations does not happen. Okay, Woodrow Wilson's dream, okay, of all these countries doing the right thing will happen. However, not having the United States is really going to be the downfall of the League of Nations, and that really is brought out in this cartoon right here, this bridge. You can see the keystone portion of the bridge, the League of Nations, would be the United States. And without the United States, okay, it's not going to be successful. For America, we go back into the isolationist 20s, we're going to call them, or the roaring 20s, if you will. And America, as we'll see in the 1920s, is going to enjoy that isolationist trend. All right, that is it. Hopefully this helps. There is so much information that I can't even do justice for in this one small video, but I have a lot of information on my slides. Feel free to go back and try to enlighten yourself on the many things that were included on those slides. All right, if you felt this helped, hope you give it a like. If not, make sure you subscribe. All right, have a wonderful day. Peace out.